Hi everybody, thanks for checking out this video. In this video, I want to look at my top 5 Twinmotion tips. These are tips that I think will help new beginners in particular with Twinmotion, and we'll look at a number of different things that I think will help you if you are new to Twinmotion or you are coming from another rendering software. There's a lot to love about Twinmotion, and it seems to get better and better every year. But there are some things that it might be beneficial to know about before you start, and hopefully you can avoid some minor frustrations. All right, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. Hi everybody, before we get into some of the tips and tricks, let's just take a quick look at our SketchUp scene, just so we know what we're working with in Twinmotion. So you can see here, pretty basic build, just a rectangle, open walls, green area where we'll examine grass, and just a handful of objects up against a wall. All right, so that looks pretty fine. In Twinmotion, we've sent it over using the Datasmith, and you can see here's our basic scene. All right, so this brings me to the first point, and really the first thing that I wish I had known when working in Twinmotion, and that is to do with camera speed. For a long time, Twinmotion really had just 3 default speeds, and they were tied to the 1, 2, and 3 keys. Now, they've since increased that to 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, with 1, so if you tap 1 on your keypad, being the slowest navigational speed. Now, this is really useful for setting up and manipulating your cameras. Number 3 is very suitable for moving around your scene, and you can see as we move around, it's generally pretty smooth. Now, speeds 4 and 5 are more useful for moving around your scene very rapidly. This is really important if you're working on very large scale projects, or if you're working on projects that will require the use of background buildings or other assets that you need to bring in. And it's a very small thing, but it's really nice to know that at any point you can adjust the speed of navigation. And honestly, it's one of the things that I wish I'd known about quite a bit when I first started in Twinmotion. As when I initially fired it up for the first time, I found myself bouncing around the scene really rapidly and was unable to figure out exactly why. All right. The next thing I want to mention is to do with viewport resolution. And again, if you've been using Twinmotion for a long time, this is probably not new to you, but it is something that I wish I'd known about coming from Lumion originally to Twinmotion, and that is Control P. And Control P is going to bring up your settings, and you've got things from the unit system, skydome resolution, all that stuff. But what we're interested in is quality. And the reason for that is Twinmotion has gotten a lot better with this. There was kind of a shaky period there for a while when performance was not great. But as it currently stands, performance is pretty good, even in these preview versions. However, you still might find that when you start adding your materials, or if you start bringing in assets from the Megascans library, and you're bringing in like 4K materials, and you've got like 30 of them in your scene, things are going to slow down. And so one way we can mitigate this slowdown is to really just go in here and adjust these. So luckily it comes with a set of presets. You could just put it down to medium or high. You could also leave certain things on maybe ultra, but drop the shadows down to medium. In the newer version of Twinmotion, we also have the options to basically downscale the viewport, which will improve performance. This is particularly noticeable with the path tracer, where you can effectively see a pared down but still somewhat accurate depiction of the path tracer. Really efficient if you're running, like me, maybe not the highest end hardware. And so it's kind of nice to have these options, and it's good to know that they are there as well. All right, everyone. The second tip that I want to talk about, or things that I wish I'd known about in Twinmotion before I started, well, it's actually kind of a few little tips here, and they're to do with lighting. The first is if you're into interior rendering, at some point there's a good chance you would have used an emissive light in one of your scenes. And you may be thinking, how do I go about doing that in Twinmotion? If I go to my lights over here, you can see we've got a lot of standard lights, a lot of IES light profile lights. And you may be thinking, well, what I need to do to make something emissive is perhaps grab this neon light and place it here. Now, that is not quite right. You can see that that is a neon light. It is not an emissive material. And so let's go ahead and delete that. We're going to go to our library and get out of lights, and we're going to go to materials. Click on this. We're going to scroll on down just a little bit, and we're going to click on neons. Okay, so I'm just going to grab neon 1. I'm going to place that on my actual lighting sconce. And now you can see when we do that, if we were to hit R on the keyboard, bring up our path tracer. Okay, you can actually see we're not getting any neon light in the scene. There we go. Just move that a little bit. And there we go. Okay, so now you can see we've got an emissive material going on. It is very, very bright, however. And this does bring me to my second sort of point when it comes to lights. Let's drop the intensity of that glow substantially. I'm going to turn off the path tracer while we do this, just to speed up performance. We'll put that quite low, make it a soft light. Going back to the library and going back to lights, and this is sort of an issue that seems to crop up a lot in the real-time rendering software engines, or at least the ones that I've experienced of. And that is to do with lights. So I'm going to grab the IES lights over here on the left, and I'm going to, you know, just like in a standard scene that you're doing, maybe place 4 or 5 of these little lights. And you'll kind of readily see what the problem is. And again, this seems to be a problem for a lot of rendering software. Hit OR on the keyboard. And again, there we go. And if you don't really see it, it's the brightness of the lights. For whatever reason, a lot of these default IES light profile lights in rendering software are really, really strong. This is true, to my mind, in Twinmotion, Lumion, D5 Render. Those are the ones that I have the most experience with. And all of these IES light profiles, or spotlights, whatever terminology you want to use, they're all really, really bright. And in fact, if you click on these lights, you can kind of see why. If I click on just one of these lights and you look over here at the intensity, the default intensity is set to 300 lumens. To my mind, this is equivalent to what you would get in like a flashlight, or if you're European, a torch. So it seems really weird that you'd have a 300 effectively lumen bulb in your house. And so almost invariably, what you have to do when it comes to putting your lights in your scene, I'm going to hold down Control and select all of these, is to just put that default light much lower. I found 50 to be a pretty safe starting point, and I'm going to go ahead and hit OR on the keyboard again. All right, that looks pretty good, bearing in mind that we don't actually have like light coming in through the window or anything else right now, so it might not look as fine. But it's a lot more realistic, it's a lot more natural looking, and you're getting, well, shadows in the corners, which is really nice. Okay, let's move on. If you've got an interior shot that perhaps has just a tiny window, or maybe you are going to see outside just a little bit, you're going to need to put some vegetation out there, because you can still see the sort of newer ground plane in the current version of Twinmotion is kind of cool, but it's also just doesn't really work for most things. You're going to want to change that. And one of the nice things you can do to set a scene or set a little bit of environment is to just have some greenery visible outside in your window. And so when it comes to the grass here, you can see I can grab grass and I can place this manually like this, and I can just place that. But we have a better way of doing this. And so what I'm going to do is go down to the bottom. By the way, this interface is a little bit different to the older versions of Twinmotion. If you're using an older version of Twinmotion, the arrangement and layout will be different. But I'm going to go to the Populate panel on the bottom. And you can see here now, I've got the option to drag a model here to start painting it on a surface. And so instead of going in and just manually, really just dabbing grass on Pollock style, I'm actually just going to grab the dry wild grass, and let me go ahead and hit populate again, and I'm going to drag that right over here. You can see when I do that, nothing happens. So I'm going to do this again, populate, and you can see you do have to hit this little icon. I'm going to move this out of the way. This little icon right here, the scatter tool, and now when I left click, there we go. The very, very cool thing about this is you can actually scatter quite a lot of things. So we can grab weeds and tall grass and just place them all into our scene. I'm holding down Control here to select them all, grab the scatter tool, and there we go. It's such a small thing, and the results are just absolutely fantastic in Twinmotion with doing this. Now, the other option, and I'm sure some of you are going to say, well, why don't you just brush in? You know, you can just go here to populate and use the paintbrush. And it comes down to really just personal preference and the unwieldiness, I find, of the brush. Honestly, I think the scatter tool is a better way of doing this, and it doesn't necessarily run into the same issues that you get. So I'm going to step back here and I'll show you what happens if we try to do this with the brush. So I'm going to go and go to populate. I'm going to do paint, and I'm going to do just wild grass here. Just grab this dry wild grass one here and paint. And I'm just going to start brushing this, and you can already see the kind of problems that you run into. Now, when I first did Twinmotion and started using it, I would do this. I would paint it on because that's sort of what I knew coming from Lumion. But quite simply, the scatter is the way to go. And I think it's a good tip for everyone is to go ahead and use that over brushing things in with the paintbrush. It's just more fine, with a lot more finesse, and doesn't come with any of these sort of weird edge problems that you might get. All right, let's move on. All right, also tied to sort of grass and foliage and vegetation is one other thing I do want to mention. And again, it's one of those things that I wish I'd known about in Twinmotion before I'd spent too long looking into it. And it's to do with trees, age, and season. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and grab just one of the trees here from really just the default Twinmotion library. This is a Japanese walnut. You can see I can place it right here on my scene. And I think it's a really beautiful looking tree. It's a very, very nice model. Now, I'm going to select it here. And you'll notice when I do that, I'll move my little camera out of the way. I'll select that here. And we have on the right now, the Japanese walnut, the name of the tree, but we also have an age slider. And this is really, really cool. So we can take this up and we can take this down, and you can see that it sort of procedurally changes or deforms the actual model, which I think is really, really cool. Now, you would use this, for example, if you were doing urban rendering and you wanted to show perhaps a new development. You're not going to populate that with these old stately trees. In fact, you're going to look for more sapling-like trees because that's what you get in a new development or new build or new design for commercial rendering. So it's really cool to be able to do this and just to be able to adjust the age and, if you will, the sort of like status of the tree. One other thing that's really, really cool about this is this option to affect the seasons. So for example, the trees will be affected by time of year. And so what you can do is use this in combination with the ambient slider. Here we can go to the environment and we can adjust the actual season. So if we wanted a particularly kind of cold autumnal look, we can do that. Or if we actually want to select our trees, put it into winter, we can adjust the age as well. And then again, go back to the ambience and we can really change the seasons here. And it's just such a small little thing, but it's sort of like really cool to be able to just do this on all of these models and give the look. You don't have to go looking for the, the dead tree category or the old tree category. You can just do this with a lot of the models that come within Twinmotion. And I think it's a really, really cool setting. All right, let's move on. Okay, everyone, so on to the next section, and this actually pertains to materials, and there are really two things that hopefully I can help you out with before they become issues for you. And again, these are things that I wish I had known about when I first started using Twinmotion, and hopefully they'll avoid a bit of frustration for you as well. Now, the first is to do with materials and actually how Twinmotion applies your materials. So for example, all of the objects in this scene just have default SketchUp materials from the warehouse. So I'm going to go to my materials tab and I'm going to grab wood and I'm going to drag this out onto the floor. I'm going to take a quick look at it, and this looks pretty good. The scale needs adjustment, but all in all, it looks pretty good. Now, however, you will find there are a couple of times you drag a material onto an object, and the scale seems to be really, really, really off. And it took me way too long to figure out what was going on and why this was. And it's due to this little thing at the top. So by default, your geometry will effectively be sort of UV-less. If you're not aware, UVs are effectively the coordinate system that telerendering software or 3D software where and how to map a texture map correctly. They aren't a huge part of architectural rendering because a lot of times you can get away with it with a very basic mapping system. But in Twinmotion, you will have things like these 4 ways that Twinmotion can wrap a material onto an object. For almost all of our use cases in Twinmotion, you're going to be mapping like wood or concrete onto flat surfaces. And so by default, generally you want them to be set to, I find, cubic UVs or from object UVs. Either one. If one of them looks bad, you can try going up here and just changing how it's done and then re-dragging out the material again. 99% of the time, you may not even have to do this because Twinmotion does a pretty good job with it. But if you do bring in a texture and you notice that it's very inaccurately resized, or you actually have to put the scale to 10 or 20 or 30 times, then almost always the issue is going to be this right here, from object UVs or cubic UVs. I've almost never really used the other ones except on objects like this. Oftentimes vase or vase UVs, applying something cubically to a cylindrical object won't look very good. So you can go ahead and change. For example, if I was to apply this, for some reason, this wood material, you can see that that just doesn't look great. But if we try putting on the spherical or cylindrical UVs, you may get a slightly better result. Now, the ultimate way to fix this really would be to UV unwrap everything. But for most SketchUp users in particular, and I don't know about like ArchiCAD or other things like that, but you're probably not familiar with UVs and you've probably never used them because a lot of that stuff, like things like vertexes and UVs, tend to be hidden away. They're sort of intentionally not there to make the programs more accessible. But if you're coming from Blender or 3D Studio Max, or even from like a game art background, which is where I learned most of my stuff about 3D, you will be familiar with UVs. But just be mindful, if something looks janky in Twinmotion when you apply a material, it really stands a very good chance of being due to these. All right. The other thing that I want to mention on materials, and again, back to things I wish I'd absolutely known about. I don't have a good example of it in this scene, but the lampshade might be sort of a good sort of case point. This lampshade that came over from SketchUp, it's not a bad model. I mean, I think from this angle it looks pretty okay. We'll fix up the materials, but it's not the most amazing model in the world, but it will work. But you'll actually notice if we look down on this, there is no thickness on the lampshade part. Now, right now it's not causing a problem, but sometimes you'll bring a model in from the warehouse and it just won't be visible. Now, you might see it over here, but you won't actually see the material or the object. The reason for this is to do with the concept of two-sided materials. In a lot of 3D programs, you have to tell the 3D program that you want the object or the material to render two-sided. A good example of this is foliage on a lot of tree models. The actual leaves usually don't have any thickness, but the material is set to display as double-sided. So you'll see both sides of it. And if you find an object in Twinmotion where you seem to be seeing through it, or you can only see it from like a specific angle, there's a good chance that the material needs to be set to two-sided. Now, in the older interface in Twinmotion, this was oddly hidden away. It was there, but it was nested within a series of other menus. In the newer version of Twinmotion, when you apply a material, the option will be over here on the right. And it's just a small little thing, but hopefully it will avoid you a lot of frustration as you try and figure out why a material is not displaying correctly. All right, with that being said, let's move on to the final little. Lastly, the last tip or pointer that I want to share with you pertains to the use of the scene graph or scene tree, depending on what terminology you want to use, over here on the right. And this is probably what might seem is probably the least interesting tip, but in many ways is probably the most functional. If you have a pile of objects, so I'm going to go to my library and I'm going to pick, for example, a pile of Chris's. Let's just array of Chris's. And okay, that's kind of weird and disturbing, but there you go, a whole pile of Chris's. This could be trees, this could be any asset, doesn't really matter. When you're working with scenes that have become very dense with objects, the best way you can approach this is to go over here, select all of your models, in this case all of the Chris's, and just right click, and what we can actually do is create, for example, just a new container, and I'm going to call this just people. You can put any title you want on this and hit enter. And so what you'll notice is all of our Chris people are now held in just effectively this container or folder is probably a better way to think of it. And why that matters is because it's easy to then just do that. And so, you know, this would apply to really anything. You could put in 3D models, you can put people, you can put trees. You can actually go ahead and sort of decorate your entire scene with 3D assets just by having them in their own containers. And the reason you'll do that is it's just really easy to hide them. It's also really easy to organize them. So for example, you don't strictly speaking have a layers palette up here. So Lumion users might be familiar with all the layers at the top. I think there's at least 10 that they allow you. Twinmotion doesn't have a layer system in the traditional sort of sense like that. What it has is this scene graph over here, and it is incredibly powerful, especially when it comes to keeping your scene nice and tidy, and especially when it comes to keeping the performance hit pretty low. And when it comes to render time, obviously, you can go ahead and just turn all of these things back on. It's a small little tip and probably not the most glamorous or you know, most flashy tip, but I promise you, of all of the ones that we've talked about today, putting things in their own container, using this sort of layer system, if you will, in Twinmotion is really, really, really valuable. And definitely get in the habit of using them, get in the habit of renaming them, and just get in the habit of using these. One other little cool thing is you can zoom to the selection right here, which I think is really, really handy as well. Okay, with that being said, I just have one last thing that I want to mention, one last tip, which invariably seems to happen on these videos. And this is a weird little thing. When it comes to navigating in D5, so tip 5.5, I'm not sure if this is just a user error on my behalf. For some reason, Twinmotion seems to pop into pedestrian mode. And when it does that, the Q and E ability to move up and down will turn off. Now, the first time this happened to me, I could not for the life of me figure out what was going on, and it drove me kind of nuts. And so this is actually tied to the M key on your keyboard. And so if it happens to you again, just hit the M key to toggle between the drone mode and the pedestrian mode. Pedestrian mode also comes with a really annoying footstep sound that you guys can probably hear a little bit in the background. And this will also drive you absolutely nuts if you can't figure out what to do about that. You can technically turn this off in the settings, but that's never really worked for me, and I don't know why. So when in doubt, when you find yourself with the Q and E keys not working and you hear a weird footstep noise, it's because you've gone into pedestrian mode. Hit M on the keyboard, and that will bring you back to the drone mode. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to call it quits for today on this video. If you've made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found at least one thing in this video that was useful. And if you did, please feel free to comment or do the usual like and subscribe thing. I know that's become a common refrain on YouTube for years now, but it really is nice for smaller channels to see people sort of engaging with the content, or either just commenting or just seeing numbers of subscriptions go up. It's a kind of nice reward for the effort put into making videos. So once again, thank you so much. And if you have subscribed already, thank you so much for doing that. I hope to see you in the next video. Cheers.